It was just after sunset when I saw the gap, a dark, yawning hole where something sacred used to be. The road ahead, which should have led straight to the heart of my family's land, now stopped dead. I let off the gas and let my truck roll slowly forward, the tires crunching over gravel and dirt. My eyes stayed fixed on the distance, and then the full truth hit me like a gut punch. The bridge was gone. Not damaged, not blocked off for repairs. Gone. The wooden structure that had stood for nearly a century, the one that connected the two halves of my ranch over the narrow creek, was missing, ripped out at the root like it never belonged there in the first place. Splintered wood jutted out at crooked angles, some pieces scattered along the muddy banks, others half submerged and drifting downstream like ghosts of what once was. I slammed the truck into park and threw open the door. My boots hit the ground hard as I moved toward the wreckage, feet slipping slightly in the dirt, but I didn't care. I was already shaking with disbelief, then fury. That bridge had been built by my grandfather with his own hands, one beam at a time. My father had kept it standing through floods and storms, patching it up when needed. And I'd restored it myself just 2 years ago, bringing in a specialist crew to ensure the original design stayed intact. It wasn't just some wooden pass over water. It was our legacy. 3 generations of our family had used that bridge to cross this land, move cattle, haul equipment, and build a life. Now, all that remained were jagged remnants, as if someone had taken a wrecking ball to our history. As I stood there, trying to catch my breath, a sudden gust of wind flapped a sign into my view. Bright orange, obnoxious, and screwed into a wooden stake planted just beside the wreckage. I didn't need to read much. The bold HOA logo at the top, Lakeside Ridge Association, was enough to make my blood boil. Underneath, in smaller, almost smug print, the words chilled me more than the wind ever could. Unauthorized structure removed for community safety, LRA Compliance Division. My fists clenched without thinking. Community safety. Unauthorized? That bridge wasn't in their community. It wasn't even close to their jurisdiction. My land sat completely outside the Lakeside Ridge boundary, and everyone, including the HOA, knew it. They had no right, no warning, and no legal leg to stand on, but they'd acted anyway, like they owned the world. And in doing so, they'd just kicked a hornet's nest they couldn't possibly understand. I reached into my coat for my phone and began documenting every inch of the scene. I didn't take the pictures out of panic. I took them because it was instinct. Years of serving as a federal judge had taught me that justice doesn't just come from outrage, it comes from evidence. My hands shook as I snapped shot after shot of the destruction, of the sign, of the twisted nails and splintered supports. But behind my shaking hands, I was already calculating. They didn't know who I was. They thought I was just some rancher on the outskirts of town, some guy with dirt on his boots and cows in his pasture. What they didn't see was the black robe that hung in my closet, the cases I'd ruled on, the officials I worked with, and the law degrees hanging on my wall. They saw a man with a pickup truck and a quiet ranch. What they didn't see was the storm they'd just unleashed. But I wasn't about to go in guns blazing. Not yet. Not before I had a plan that would bring them down harder than they ever imagined. Behind me, I heard the crunch of tires rolling over the gravel. I turned quickly, half expecting more trouble. But it was Martin, my ranch hand and old friend, pulling up in his truck. He stepped out slowly, taking in the scene with narrowed eyes and a tense jaw. "Hey, Judge. You all right?" His voice was quiet, like he was trying to confirm what he was seeing wasn't just a bad dream. I nodded stiffly but didn't take my eyes off the shattered beams. He walked up beside me and stared in silence. "Who did this?" he finally asked. I didn't need to look at him to answer. "The HOA," I said coldly. He blinked. "You mean the same HOA that told you last month they had no interest in your land?" I nodded. "They said I was outside their zone, not part of their plan." He stared at the mess again. "And now this." His voice held disbelief, but mine didn't. I was already past disbelief. I was locked into something deeper, something cold and deliberate. Martin didn't say anything else. He knew me well enough to understand the wheels were turning. We spent the next half hour in heavy silence, gathering the scattered boards we could find, stacking them by the creek, trying to make sense of the wreckage. But no amount of stacking would bring that bridge back, not the one they destroyed. That bridge was more than just timber and bolts. It was a promise. Something my grandfather had built not just for utility, but for pride. It had stood as a monument to our roots, our endurance, and now it lay in ruin because some HOA bureaucrats thought it clashed with their landscaping vision. By the time the sun fully dipped behind the hills, casting everything in that dull grey twilight, I knew what I had to do. I didn't wait for morning. I didn't wait to cool off. I got in my truck, turned the ignition, and drove straight to the HOA office. It was a slick building, clearly over-budgeted and designed to impress. Glass doors, polished stone facade, and that same fountain out front that never seemed to work. Inside, the air was cold and sterile. The receptionist looked up from her desk with a look that said she'd rather be anywhere else. "Can I help you?" she asked flatly. "I need to speak with whoever authorized the demolition of the bridge on my ranch," I said, steady and firm. She tapped something on her screen, clearly unmoved. "And you are?" "Judge Carter," I replied. Her fingers stopped moving. That got her attention, but she masked it well. Before she could respond, a tall, balding man emerged from a side office, clearly drawn by my tone. His name tag said, Ed Branson, HOA Vice President. He walked up with a customer service smile and offered a handshake I didn't take. "Is there a problem, sir?" "Yes," I said, voice level. "I'd like to know why your organization tore down a historic, federally registered structure on my private property." His smile wavered for just a second, then returned, smug and patronizing. "Oh, that old bridge. It looked like a hazard. We had some complaints about its appearance and our compliance team decided to remove it for safety." I stared at him. "Did you file with the county, the state, the Federal Preservation Office?" He shrugged, utterly unconcerned. "Didn't think it was necessary. Honestly, we thought we were doing everyone a favor." My jaw tensed. "You weren't. What you did was a serious legal violation. That bridge was protected under federal law." He chuckled. "If it's about some permit, we can work something out. But frankly, judge or not, if you're part of this community—" "I'm not," I cut in. "My land isn't part of your subdivision. It never has been." His brows furrowed, clearly confused. "Well, maybe it's time your property joined the community." And that was it. That's what this was about. Not safety, not aesthetics, control. They wanted my land. They wanted to expand their zone, raise fees, boost their little empire, and they thought I was just an old man with a bridge in their way. But what Ed didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to make sure they never touched anyone's land again. They thought they were playing chess. What they didn't realize was that I'd already written the rules of the game, and I was just getting started. The morning after my confrontation at the HOA office, I stood at the edge of the creek where the bridge had once been, the early mist curling over the muddy banks like the memory of what they'd destroyed. It still didn't feel real, but the rage had settled into something colder, something clearer. I wasn't going to let this go. This wasn't just about my land anymore. This was about the principle of it. The nerve they had to march onto a man's property and tear down a registered historic structure as if it were a rotting fence post. So I did what any man in my position would do. I started marking that territory again, not with fences, but with law. I posted federal property signs along the boundaries near the creek, then stretched yellow caution tape between wooden stakes right where the bridge used to begin and end. I painted the words "Crime Scene Federal Property" in bold black letters on 2 large boards and planted them on either bank. This wasn't just for show. I was laying down a line they couldn't cross without consequence. Martin showed up later in the day, truck loaded with gear, tools, and the kind of steel resolve I recognized from men who'd seen enough of life to know when something had gone too far. "You're serious about this?" he asked, watching me hammer a stake into the ground. "As a heart attack," I said, not missing a beat. Together, we spent the afternoon installing trail markers and boundary flags. I wasn't just trying to keep them out, I was drawing a line in the sand. They'd already violated that line once. I knew deep in my gut they weren't finished. The HOA didn't back down because of a few signs. No, they saw this as a challenge, and I was ready for the next move. That night, long after the sun dipped below the hills and the cicadas took over the soundtrack of the ranch, I sat in my office reviewing case notes when my phone lit up. A notification. I opened the app, and what I saw didn't surprise me, but it set my blood boiling all over again. 3 figures on my land, dressed in dark clothing, flashlights low, moving with the kind of clumsy stealth that said they weren't professionals, but weren't supposed to be there either. They were walking the creek bed where the bridge had been, examining the signs, snapping photos, kicking over stakes. One of them even reached down and started collecting pieces of wood, like they were trying to build a case that the land was abandoned or misused. My jaw clenched. I didn't need to guess who sent them. This was HOA reconnaissance, an attempt to document whatever scrap of dirt they could use to claim the land was neglected or in violation of their imaginary standards. I called Martin and said one word: trespassers. 10 minutes later, we were rolling across the land in the ATV, lights off, moving quiet under the moonlight. The air was sharp and cold, and every bump of the trail only added to the tension in my chest. When we got close, I saw them. 2 were scribbling into notepads. The third was planting little colored flags in the soil, mapping my land, treating it like a vacant lot on some development blueprint. That's when I hit the headlights. They froze instantly. One dropped his clipboard and bolted into the trees. The other 2 spun around, mouths open, trying to act innocent. "We're just lost," one of them stammered. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I lifted my phone and started taking photos. Then I delivered the words that took the color from their faces. "You're trespassing on federally protected land." They didn't even try to lie, just turned and ran. By the time the sun rose the next morning, I had those images printed, labeled, and time-stamped. Along with them, I placed copies of the HOA's demolition memo, statements I had taken, and references to the bridge's historical registration. I was putting together a legal ambush, and every move they made gave me more ammunition, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. The explosion shook the house. A deep, violent boom that rattled the windows and sent the birds screaming from the trees. Martin burst into the room seconds later, eyes wide. "They blew up your shed," he said, breathless. I didn't waste a second, pulled on my boots, grabbed the fire extinguisher from the barn wall, and ran. But it was already too late. The shed was engulfed in flames. My tools, fencing wire, feed, everything inside was being eaten alive by the blaze. The air reeked of burning plastic and chemicals, and thick black smoke coiled into the sky like a signal of war. We tried to douse it with the hose, but it was pointless. The fire had a head start, and I could tell by the pattern of the flames, by the force of the blast, by the scorch marks in the dirt, this wasn't a careless spark. Someone had used fuel, maybe fireworks, maybe worse. There was a shattered gas can lying yards from the impact site. This was no accident. This was a message. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my office with the lights off, watching footage, piecing together timelines. And there it was, clear as the noonday sun. One of the same trespassers from earlier that week, captured just after sunset, sneaking toward the shed. Minutes later, the screen lit up with a white-hot flash and the camera feed went dead. I backed it up, recorded the clip, and sent it to both my lawyer and a trusted contact at the US Marshal's office. This wasn't just trespassing anymore. This was arson on federally protected land. This was a federal crime, and the HOA had just crossed a line they couldn't step back from. The following morning, I filed an official report with the sheriff's department. The deputy who arrived, a young guy named Rob, looked like he wasn't quite sure what to make of it all, until I showed him my ID and laid out the facts. His eyes widened. "You're a federal judge?" I nodded. "And that shed wasn't just on my land. It was on the same parcel that holds the registered bridge site." He paused, then called in a supervisor. By noon, my property was crawling with law enforcement. The bomb squad arrived. They confirmed what I already knew. It was no accident. The press didn't need a press release. The story was writing itself. But through all this, I still hadn't heard a word from the HOA. Not a letter, not a call, not even a denial. It was the kind of silence that comes just before a storm. And I wasn't going to wait for it to land. The bridge was gone. The shed was ash. My cattle still grazed, unaware that our land was now the center of a war. But I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was preparing. I reinforced the fencing, installed more boundary signs, and started drafting new legal motions. I wasn't going to let this fade into another quiet injustice. I was going to drag it all into the light. Then came the crew in yellow vests. I spotted them late one afternoon, standing beside my utility pole, lowering equipment into the back of their truck. I jogged down from the house, already suspicious. One of them, clearly the lead, turned to me as I approached. "We're from Ridgecom, the HOA's internet provider," he said, "just pulling out some outdated booster gear as part of the coverage realignment." I narrowed my eyes. That booster was installed by my provider, not Ridgecom. He blinked. "We were told this area was now part of the HOA's extended coverage zone." I pulled out my parcel map. "This is not HOA property," I said flatly. "And that equipment isn't yours. You're removing private infrastructure." He turned pale. "We got a call from the association office, said it was approved." I lifted my phone. "You just admitted to removing private property on an order from someone who doesn't own it. That's theft." He stammered, backpedaled, and scrambled into the truck with his team. But the damage was done. They were trying to push me off my land in every way possible. Physically, legally, and now digitally. The next morning, I filed another formal complaint. I added the incident to my growing file: trail cam photos, demolition records, shed explosion evidence, and now the telecom theft. It wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was a case study in HOA overreach, and I was ready to turn it into a reckoning. But just when I thought I had seen the worst of their tactics, a letter arrived that sent my blood running cold. Martin handed it to me without a word. I opened the envelope and unfolded the paper. Red ink blared across the top. Notice of property foreclosure intent. The HOA claimed I owed over $27,000 in back dues, violation fees, and penalties. Every single one of them fabricated, completely made up. I wasn't part of their community. I didn't owe them a cent. But there it was, in black and white. A threat to seize my land if I didn't pay within 30 days. They weren't trying to negotiate. They were trying to steal my ranch, the home my grandfather built, the land my father died protecting. The bridge they destroyed was only the beginning. That night, as the wind swept across the now empty creek bed, I sat on the porch with my boots propped against the railing, watching the stars blink above the horizon. I whispered to the night, a promise as cold and hard as steel. "You wanted a war. You've got one." Then I stood, walked into the office, and opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. Inside was an envelope I'd prepared weeks ago, signed, sealed, and ready. A federal injunction. I picked up my phone and made the call. "Marshal Wilkins," I said, "you still got that open docket for property disputes?" He didn't hesitate. "Send everything you've got," he said. "We'll open it first thing in the morning." And just like that, the fight became official. I wasn't just defending my land anymore. I was taking the HOA to federal court. And they had no idea what was coming. By the time dawn broke over the hills the next morning, my case was already on the federal docket. Everything, the illegal bridge demolition, the arson, the trespassing, the telecom theft, the fabricated lien, had been organized into a comprehensive report and submitted with an emergency injunction request. This wasn't just a civil dispute anymore. It was a coordinated campaign of harassment, manipulation, and destruction. And as I sat at my kitchen table sipping black coffee, the wind rattling the windows and the distant creek murmuring through the silence, I knew the storm had finally begun to shift. For once, the pressure was moving in their direction. 3 days passed before the next major turn. I was up before the sun, fixing a hinge on the back gate, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a firm, measured voice spoke on the other end. "Judge Carter, this is Hannah Thomas, Department of Justice. I'm the lead investigator assigned to your case." I paused, nodded once to myself. "I'm ready," I said. "We've reviewed your file," she continued. "This is more than HOA negligence. You've exposed a pattern of deliberate overreach that may have national implications. We're opening a multi-agency task force, and your property is ground zero." I told her she could inspect the land any time. She replied, "I'll be there this week." After the call, I took a slow walk around the ranch. The land felt tense, like it knew it was being watched. The air carried a kind of stillness that wasn't natural, not for this time of year. That's when I noticed the sedan. White. Parked just beyond the fence line, engine idling. I couldn't see the driver's face, but the silhouette didn't move. Just sat there, watching. It was the same car I'd seen last week near the creek, the same one I'd thought was just some lost contractor. This time, it wasn't passing through. I stared hard. No plates, no motion. Martin came up beside me, narrowed his eyes. That the same one? I nodded. We got in my truck and crept down the gravel path, tires crackling over stone. The second we neared, the car peeled out, tires spinning, dust flying in the air as it disappeared over the ridge. I memorized the plate number scrawled behind the tinted glass. Called the sheriff. A few hours later, the deputy called back. Registered to Ridgecom, he said. Of course. The HOA's own telecom partner. First, they tried to take down my bridge. Now they were tailing me like I was some threat to be contained. That evening I sat out on the porch, arms crossed as the wind picked up across the fields. The stars blinked in above, cold and clear. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. I knew the pieces were coming together, and I knew they'd strike again soon. They had to. Desperation always forces a hand, and I was right. It happened 2 nights later. No legal notice, no confrontation, no warning, just tires rolling across gravel. A black SUV with no plates. It pulled up quietly just outside the northern gate. Martin and I were working late, fixing the latch that some storm had bent the week before. We paused when the headlights swept across the pasture. The window rolled down. The man inside was clean-cut, early 40s, sharp suit that didn't match the setting, and a look that said he was used to giving orders. He didn't introduce himself, just smiled faintly and said, "You're making a lot of noise for someone who lives so quiet." I stepped closer. "Who are you?" He didn't answer, just kept the smirk on his face. "A friend of the association. Thought you might want to talk off the record." Martin stepped up beside me, jaw tight. "You threatening a federal judge?" The man chuckled, not kindly. "Just saying there are better ways to settle things. HOA drama tends to blow over. You push too hard, people get uncomfortable. Nobody likes a mess." I took a slow step forward, staring through the open window. "Let me tell you something," I said quietly. "I spent my life studying liars. I spent decades tearing apart false testimony. And I've looked in the eyes of men facing federal time. You've got that same look right now. You're scared. And you should be." The man's smirk faded. He rolled the window up and drove away. No words, no threat. Just the soft hiss of tires fading into the dark. I called Hannah and gave her the report. She listened, then sighed. "We're not just dealing with HOA board members," she said. "We think they've brought in outside contractors. Possibly security firms or consultants working through shell companies, real estate development tactics. Classic playbook." I already knew that. The level of precision, the funding, the moves. It was too sophisticated to be local board volunteers on a power trip. Someone else was pulling strings behind the curtain, and they were getting sloppy. The next morning, I held a press conference. Nothing flashy, just me, Martin, and a dozen neighbors who had come to help rebuild the bridge. I stood in front of the blackened remains of the shed, hands at my sides, and spoke directly to the reporters. "This isn't about my bridge," I said. "It's about how unchecked power can corrupt even the smallest systems. An HOA was given a sliver of authority and turned it into a weapon. They broke laws, they burned down history, and they tried to steal what didn't belong to them. But what they didn't count on was that someone would stand up, someone could, and someone did." I didn't need applause. I didn't need headlines. What I needed was pressure. And that's exactly what I got. Within days, the story hit national news. Homeowners from across the country began emailing. Veterans, widows, single parents, each one with their own tale of HOA overreach. Garden beds fined, flags taken down, houses foreclosed over paint colors. My lawsuit became a rallying cry. Congress began drafting what they called the Homeowner Fairness Act, legislation that would require third-party oversight for HOAs and criminal accountability for any unlawful seizure of property. The movement was growing, but while the spotlight shone brighter, the HOA was still trying to claw its way out. That's when Ed Branson made his boldest move yet. One late night, as we neared the final stages of rebuilding the bridge, Martin came rushing from the barn, breath ragged. "You need to come outside, now." I followed him up to the ridge, where the new bridge stood nearly complete, and my stomach turned. 3 massive construction vehicles sat just beyond the build site, engines idling, floodlights cutting through the darkness like search beams. Behind them stood Ed himself. No hard hat, no shame, just that same smug expression that had greeted me in the HOA office weeks ago. I stormed toward him. "You've got 5 seconds to get those machines off my land." Ed raised his walkie, didn't flinch. "Don't move," he told the driver, then turned to me. "You built without a permit," he said calmly. "It's a safety hazard. I have every right to remove it." "You have no rights here," I snapped. "This land isn't yours, never was." He held out a folder. "We refiled our district maps. Your land was mistakenly omitted. It's been corrected, filed with the county this morning." I yanked the folder from his hand. Fake survey documents, backdated approvals, signatures I knew were forged. "You just committed forgery," I said coldly. Ed shrugged. "We'll see what the county says. The board already approved it." Martin stepped between us, fists clenched. "You better leave before someone gets hurt." Ed didn't budge. His eyes moved over the bridge, the volunteers, the reporters filming from a distance. "You're not going to win," he said. "Even if you get your bridge back, your land is next. We'll find a way. Sooner or later, people like you fold." I stared straight through him. "I'm not folding," I said. "I'm setting the table." Just then, headlights crested the road, 2 black SUVs. The doors opened in sync, and out stepped the US Marshals. At the lead, Marshal Wilkins himself. "Mr. Branson," he called, holding up his badge, "you're under arrest for trespassing on protected land and interfering with a federal investigation." Ed's face paled. "Wait, what? This is private property." "Exactly," Wilkins said, and motioned for the cuffs. Within moments, Ed was in the back seat of a federal vehicle, screaming about lawyers and conspiracies. No one paid him any mind. The construction machines were removed, the crew left quietly, and the build resumed at sunrise. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Because while Ed was in custody, I got a call from Hannah that changed everything. "Judge," she said, "we traced the HOA's funding. A large portion comes from an offshore firm out of Miami, real estate developers known for hostile takeovers of rural land. Your HOA was a front." I didn't say anything at first, then I clenched my jaw. "So it was never about community," I said. "Exactly," she replied. "It was always about the land. And that meant we weren't just facing board members anymore. We were up against something bigger, something systemic. But they'd chosen the wrong ranch, and the war had only just begun." The bridge was finished on a crisp Sunday morning just after sunrise, the kind of morning that made the air taste clean and the grass seem to glow. Dew still clung to the tips of the fence posts, and the creek below whispered beneath the weight of a new beginning. The rebuilt structure stood strong, proud, every plank secured with care, every beam echoing a promise carved long ago by hands now gone. It wasn't just wood anymore. It was a declaration, standing in defiance of the people who thought they could rip history out by its roots and bury it without consequence. The final nail had been set, painted gold and etched with the date. At the center of the new handrail, we'd placed a bronze plaque, one line from a note my grandfather had written decades ago, sealed in a rusted box we found beneath the foundation during the rebuild. "To my sons and grandsons, may this bridge always keep our family connected no matter what storms try to tear it down." The community came out in force to see it. Neighbors I'd never met, folks from 2 counties over, even a few kids from the high school shop class who had helped sand and stain the support beams stood with their parents, beaming with pride. There were handshakes, pats on the back, and plenty of folks who simply walked across the bridge once, turned around, and did it again just to feel the permanence of it under their feet. Some brought food, others brought tools they no longer needed, but everyone brought one thing: unity. They understood that this wasn't just about my ranch anymore. It was about every family who'd ever had to fight to hold on to something precious while the gears of power tried to crush them into silence. But as the applause faded and the crowd began to thin, the next chapter of the war stepped forward, quietly, as always, but no less dangerous. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the edge of my property. The man who stepped out was tall, sharp-jawed, dressed in a dark blazer and slacks that hadn't seen dust or dirt in years. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just walked up to me and extended a leather-bound briefcase. "What's this?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "An offer," he replied. "One you'll want to read carefully." Then he turned, walked back to the car, and drove off before I could say another word. Inside the briefcase, a single page sat atop a thick folder. At the top of the page, the name of a major real estate development firm, one I recognized from the DOJ reports. Below it, a number, an 8-figure cash offer for the ranch, contingent on immediate transfer and silence. They wanted me to sell everything, walk away, and forget. It wasn't about money anymore. It never was. They thought this land, this fight, could be boiled down to a dollar amount. I didn't even hesitate. I folded the page once, walked to the edge of the creek, and tossed it into the water. Some things aren't for sale. Not bridges, not legacy, and definitely not justice. By then, the DOJ had taken the gloves off. Investigators had traced the funding of not just my HOA, but dozens of others across multiple states, all linked back to the same offshore shell companies, all using the same aggressive tactics: false liens, fabricated violations, property sabotage, and predatory development schemes masked as community improvement plans. And while Ed Branson sat behind bars, awaiting his arraignment, the deeper layers of the conspiracy were being pulled into the light. Subpoenas went out to Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Texas. Whistleblowers emerged, records were seized, the press swarmed. And still, here on the ranch, I remained quiet, focused, because even though the battle was going my way, I knew better than to think it was over. A week later, the sky buzzed again. Not with birds or wind, but with drones. Low-flying machines hovered over the pasture, the barn, the roof of my house. 4 of them, then 6. They flew in tight patterns, scanning, capturing. One zipped so low it nearly clipped the windshield of Martin's truck. He came storming out of the barn, hand raised, cursing the machines. They were back to watching us again. We reported it immediately. The FAA issued cease and desist notices to the suspected operators, but the drones kept coming. They were like mosquitoes from a swamp you couldn't drain, so I decided to swat them the old-fashioned way. We built anti-drone net launchers, simple mechanical crank rigs with weighted nets. Took a few tries, but we got the rhythm down. Within 3 days, we'd captured 7 drones, each one tagged with a serial number and linked back to a shell company registered in the Caymans, the same developer that had funded the HOA. They weren't even being subtle anymore. But I wasn't worried. Every drone we captured was turned over to the feds, every serial number was a nail in the coffin, and then came the final escalation. I was out feeding the cattle one morning when I saw something fall from the sky, small, black, with a blinking red light. It landed near the fence post with a soft thud. I picked it up carefully. Not a bomb. A tracker. They were still trying to monitor our movements, still digging for anything they could use. Martin and I swept the ranch with handheld scanners, found 2 more devices, one hidden beneath the weather vane on the barn, another planted beneath the dashboard of the ATV. That's when it hit me. Someone on the inside had been leaking information. We hadn't just been a target, we'd been infiltrated. I called Hannah. The federal team swept the area again and confirmed it. They had enough now. Enough to press charges not just on the HOA board, but the developers, the shell company heads, the offshore financial operators. The DOJ issued a sweeping RICO indictment. Racketeering, wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, mail fraud, attempted unlawful seizure of federally protected land. The press release made headlines. Federal judge's ranch at center of nationwide HOA sting. Phones rang off the hook. Emails poured in. Homeowners from coast to coast reached out with stories, photos, legal files, each one more shocking than the last. People who had nearly lost their homes over garden flags. Veterans evicted over mailbox height. Retirees fined for bird baths. And suddenly, my bridge wasn't just a bridge. It was a symbol of resistance, of the power one voice could have when it refused to be silenced. The final blow came through Congress. Lawmakers proposed the Homeowner Fairness Act, calling for strict oversight, federal accountability, and a nationwide audit of HOA financial records. The bill had teeth, and it had momentum. But none of that compared to what came next. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the land turned gold with quiet pride, I stood with Martin by the fence, sweet tea in hand. We watched the cattle graze beneath the finished bridge. It felt peaceful for the first time in months. He glanced sideways at me and asked, half joking, "You ever think about selling, taking that check, starting fresh somewhere else?" I laughed. "They offered me enough to buy 10 ranches." He raised a brow. "And?" I took a deep breath and looked out at the bridge, sturdy and still in the amber light. I wouldn't trade this land for all the gold in Texas. Later that night, the phone rang. Judge Janet Miller, her voice steady. "Carter," she said. "They've pled guilty, all of them, board members, developers, executives, a full sweep." I didn't speak for a long moment, just stared out the window. The stars above the bridge shone bright, and the creek below flowed like it always had. Calm, certain, undisturbed. Peace had returned, not because I'd yelled the loudest or struck the hardest, but because I had stood firm, because I had refused to fold when the pressure mounted, and because when they tried to tear down my bridge, they forgot one thing. Some things are built too strong to break. The battle was never about power, it was about legacy, about a family's place on the land, about knowing that justice, real justice, doesn't come from shouting. It comes from standing your ground when it counts. And when you do, no matter how powerful the enemy, they learn a hard truth. You don't mess with a man's legacy, and you sure as hell don't tear down his bridge,